Hello and welcome to Decoding Risk, where we give you expert insights on trending topics in the insurance industry. I'm your host, Edward Pronley, one of the marketing content managers here at Fusable, and today we're talking about insurance claims and the importance of detailed documentation, specifically for the benefit of motor carriers and fleets. Joining us for our episode today is Chad Krueger, our Vice President and Managing Director of our Risk Intelligence here at Fusable. Welcome, Chad.
Happy to be here.
To start us off, can you talk a bit about what is included in documentation for motor carriers and why it is such a critical factor in commercial trucking insurance claims?
Yeah, well, especially in the transportation industry, documentation is key, and that documentation can be anything from orientation to driver qualification files to the hiring process to ongoing training, electronic logging devices. Just there's so many different things that need to be documented, and whether it be from a claim standpoint or just operating in a legal standpoint, that we need to make sure that we've got in place for folks because it will oftentimes be needed in the future.
So, when looking at or when assessing a claim outcome, how do insurers weigh documentation, beyond simply just determining who's at fault?
The documentation is going to need to be very thorough and important that folks are gathering the information from a claim standpoint. If we end up having a situation, whether it's a terrible situation or a standard claim situation, there's so many of these claims that become litigious and they become much longer term situations where perhaps employees or drivers or different people have actually left the organization before this stuff gets all litigated out. So that orientation standpoint, all of that documentation from the driver qualification files, the logging devices, post accident, different things like that, corrective actions, all of those things are going to be equally important, but there is the difference between the things that are collected by, a human versus things that are collected by a device. So example, an electronic logging device, a camera, something to that effect. Those kind of details and data and evidence are kind of it's irrefutable information. But then also, especially with the cameras, it's very, very helpful in kind of getting a very fast assessment of what happened in the situation so that it can be taken care of quickly. I mean, very clearly, people will tell you that claims people, uh, organizations that use dash cams, they will tell you that it very quickly helps you determine, okay, well, were we at fault? Was somebody else at fault? And there's no disputing that, and they can generally resolve those relatively quickly.
So, I heard you mention human documentation versus something like electronic logging devices or cameras. So, I'm assuming when it comes to human documentation, there are some human errors that can occur. Are there other common documentation failures that you see that can delay or complicate insurance claims?
Yeah, when there's different things like when you look at driver qualification files and things like that, maybe you're not getting the information, maybe you're not storing it properly. Again, there are different things that when you're looking at a situation, you want to make sure that certain things are in place, and that's again where the industry tends and claims people and plaintiffs attorneys and different folks like that, they tend to lean heavily on the data side of things, which we're all very familiar with. But it's very important that not only when the incident occurs, but that data is kept and it's secured as long as it needs to be, because again, it'll be part of discovery if it wasn't brought forth, initially. So, yes, in the case where people are, whether it's the orientation process or getting certain sign offs or following the steps of a particular post crash incident procedure for an organization, if you're not checking all the boxes, that can become a problem, and that is where human error can become somewhat of an issue.
So there's an article by Commercial Carrier Journal, which we'll include in the episode description, that breaks down several core documentation types. That includes dash cam footage, electronic logging devices, driver records, maintenance. Out of these, which type tends to have the biggest impact on claim resolution?
100%, 110%, 1,000%, whatever you want to say. Very, very, very important is that dash cam footage. And again, driver facing, I saw an article and I forget exactly what it was, but 5 years ago, the adoption of a driver facing dash cam was very, very low. And in the past couple of years, it's now well beyond 50%. So it's definitely going in that direction of not only having the camera that looks out the front of the truck, but also has a view on the driver, because that dash cam footage, even though, and again, the vast majority of crashes are the fault of not the truck driver, or not the motor carrier, and it's something in the neighborhood of 80% or well over 80% or something to that perspective. So why would you not want to have evidence if 80% of the time it's going to show that you were not at fault? And not only that, 80% of the time, it's very helpful with the mitigation of that claim so that it can be sent. And the first notice of loss is very important. And that's where telematics and dash cam footage is very helpful. But it allows your partners at the insurance carrier, the claim adjusters, the attorneys out there, to be able to very quickly assess, hey, is this something that is very clearly the other party's responsibility? Is it our responsibility? But you can definitely get that addressed very, very quickly and mitigated more quickly. And that's where, if you don't have that camera footage and it becomes perhaps a he said, or he said, she said, and now it's stretching on months into years, that documentation gets more, the memories get more fuzzy, the documentation that might not be as reliable becomes more important. And then it just tends to cost more and more money. So mitigating that claim as quickly as possible with that camera, that dash cam footage, is so important, whether it ends up being the fault of the motor carrier or not. If they look at it and it is the motor carrier's fault or the driver's fault, again, that can be addressed very quickly. They can go to resolution of that claim very quickly, not try to battle it out in court or something to that effect. So it's very, very helpful to have that dash cam footage.
To know. And I heard you mention kind of the magic word telematics. Can you speak to the difference between basic documentation, such as the documentation types of dashcam footage, ELDs, and driver records, but also stuff like paper logs, which I'm sure are still being used today, versus telematics data in an incident?
Yeah, paper logs, and I've been in the business long enough to remember, as a safety director at a trucking company, having a stack of logs and DVIR, driver vehicle inspection reports, that I was basically going through and reviewing. But yeah, with log books, it's there's a lot of potential human error. There's also a decent potential for misrepresentation in those logs, and that's where the move to the ELDs a number of years ago, the electronic logging device, the goal with that was to have more of an accurate record of what that driver is doing and how the vehicle is operating and things like that. So those have become very helpful, although still not a perfect system. That's very, very helpful. But even moving beyond the electronic logging device, where you're just getting the minimum information to meet the standards of the ELD mandate, moving on to that telematics piece where we're able to gather data from hard braking, speed, different things like that, to be able to understand. And that's where using those devices that will get you that information, and then the documentation becomes a piece of, okay, are we monitoring that information? Are we addressing some of the driver behaviors that maybe would lead to a crash? And that's where, if we're going to pay to have those systems in our equipment to meet the standards, or to mitigate claims, or to better our driver behavior, or to have driver life cycle coaching, it's very important that we are paying attention to it. We're using the system, we're addressing it with the drivers, we're doing corrective actions in order to make sure that we're helping our drivers and vehicles operate at peak efficiency and peak safety. But if we have that information, we're collecting that data, and it's all there and available, and we're not doing anything with it, and we're not trying to address these situations, that's an example of where data can become actually a potential negative. So it's important that you're using the solution for what it was intended for, and doing that coaching and corrective action. because that ELD data, again, is going to ping that device. We're going to know the speed. We're going to know the geolocation. We're going to know what was going on. We're going to know if there was a hard break. We're going to know all kinds of different things that are very, very helpful in driver coaching. But again, if you're not acting on those things, it can become an issue. So that's where a motor carrier being able to the have the bandwidth to be able to help your drivers and understand that data is going to be very, very important.
So it sounds like telematics can have a pretty big impact on motor carriers if they decide to adopt it. Can it have an effect on their insurance costs over time as well?
Absolutely. The telematics data is becoming very, very important out there, and insurance carriers have been looking at it for many years. There's a number of different insurance solution program managers and things like that are actually mandating telematics information be a part of the data that they evaluate, even prior to evaluating or bonding a policy. So those are things that motor carriers need to understand, that those electronic logging devices, no matter how simple they are collecting data. Insurance carriers use that information to understand the exposure of that particular motor carrier, and the exposure can be anything as far as, geolocation, where they're operating, the time of the day that they're operating, different things like that out there. But it's very, very helpful for the insurance carrier because, as we all know, insurance continues to get more and more expensive. Insurance carriers are running a 110, 115% loss ratio. The ultimate goal is to make sure that we're able to provide economical insurance for those motor carriers that are doing that are operating safely out there, and get them great rates and great coverages to help them continue their business, because that's what insurance is for. So the sharing of that telematics data is helpful because it helps that insurance carrier understand, again, where we're operating, how are we operating, the times of day, and there's different ways that they price insurance based on rates. I always use the example of, most people are familiar with providing their mileage in the state that they operate there, and people can say, "Well, hey, we were operate 5,000 miles in the state of Illinois." Well, there's different rates based on where they operate. If that all of those miles are in the Chicago Loop, that's a much more potential area to have an incident. Obviously, traffic, but if they're operating in like Southern Illinois, in the beautiful farm and corn country down there, that's a whole different, less of an exposure. So that's important for the insurance carrier to understand, because then they can price appropriately and rate appropriately. And that motor carrier can understand that, hey, I'm paying for the exposure that I'm providing here. Other things is a mileage based or usage based insurance pricing. I want to pay for my insurance based on the miles that I operate in a month. And that is where those ELDs can be very, very helpful as well. In addition to that, having that insurance carrier understand the behaviors of those of the drivers and the vehicles and things like that out there, you can really leverage the assistance that the insurance carrier, loss control safety folks, the insurance agency safety folks, having that additional set of eyes to help the motor carrier get the best out of the data and help them improve for the long term.
So, another type of documentation is also driver training documentation. What role can that play in both safety and claims handling?
Yeah, that driver training piece, whether it be the orientation where they're helping drivers understand expectations and how they're operating, and it's very important that we make sure that we do spend a good amount of time when we bring those drivers on. I've had the opportunity to audit some of those courses throughout my career, and the best ones do spend a good amount of time with refresher training on safety regulations and different things like that, driver behavior, how to operate the vehicle safely. Bringing someone on and just saying, "Oh, well, you've got a CDL, you've been driving for 10 years, here's the keys, go nuts." That's something that, or I shouldn't say go nuts, but hit the road. That's something where it is the motor carrier has a huge, huge potential exposure, where they need to make sure that that driver understands the safe operation of the equipment, what is expected. Moving on to the telematics or the camera systems or the ELDs, that's a documentation piece where if you've got an example of a driver that is continually hard braking or is exhibiting a behavior that could potentially cause an incident, that documentation needs to be used to address it with that driver. And again, it's not necessarily saying that the driver needs to be fired, but some coaching, some monitoring, helping that driver reduce that. And there's ways to do that through safety incentive. There's ways to do that a number of different ways, but that documentation is very important, whether it be from the safety side of things or the claim side of things. Is you have to be able to act on that documentation. And if that driver doesn't change their behavior, then perhaps there's an opportunity for that driver to be exited from the organization or something like that if it comes to an extreme situation. But again, that data should be used for driver life cycle training, right? We should be encouraging them and providing updated documentation or updated training and solutions and resources and things like that to help that driver be the best driver that they possibly can, which will then help the organization. So that documentation is huge. The data that we're collecting, using it to make sure that we're helping our organization improve, is definitely going to be valuable, because if that becomes a claim situation, that's where you're going to be able to show that to say, yes, this driver, this is the example of how the driver operates. This is the corrective action that we used, or this is how they improved. This is the steps we took. And that's going to be very defensible in a claims or court situation. Whereas if you're not paying attention to it or not acting on those things, it can become something that is not helpful in those situations.
Chad, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has been a great conversation about documentation and the importance of it for motor carriers and fleets. If you could leave our listeners with one key takeaway about documentation and potentially telematics and managing insurance risk, what would it be?
Yeah, that from the telematics and things like that, if you're part of an organization and you haven't gone down the camera route, whether it be just forward facing or forward and cab facing, you are behind the curve. There's many, many organizations out there that are using those things. It can be very, very helpful in that mitigation piece. And again, moving on to that documentation portion, where if we're collecting data and a driver is behaving or is showing um, behavior that is potentially concerning, it needs to be coached and it needs to be addressed. And those are the things that are very, very important. That collecting data is great and it's very important and it's all available and out there, but being able to act on that by coaching is going to be very, very important and help it be as defensible as possible in the worst case situation. So camera, and then making sure that we are using the data and information that we're getting to coach and improve our drivers, because we want them to be our drivers for the long term, and it's going to help the organization as a whole.
Completely agree. Thank you so much again for joining us. And thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of Decoding Risk. Stay tuned for our next episode, and you can find that article from Commercial Carrier Journal in our episode description. Thank you.
Thank you.